All right, we're going to get started now. So welcome to our webinar tonight, Standing Out in the Law School Admissions Process. We're both really excited to have everyone here to learn more about how to become more competitive law school applicants. So we'll begin with some introductions. I'm Gisela. I graduated with my BA from Cornell, where I studied history, Spanish, international relations, law and society, and Latin American studies. It's a little bit of a mouthful. I most recently completed my master's degree in international relations, international education policy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We are really lucky to be here tonight with Joel Butterly, the Ingenious Prep co-founder and CEO. Joel, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Joel. I was born in the Boston area, but grew up a little north of there in Vermont. Went to Dartmouth College. While there, I triple majored in government, geography, and then ethical philosophy. So really nothing of use, coming out of college. I went to Yale Law School. I was very fortunate in the admissions process to have been admitted to Yale, Harvard, and Stanford. And so we'll talk a little bit about sort of my own personal experiences in the admissions process throughout the presentation, but very happy to be here. And I don't really understand why this light is like reflecting off my forehead, so you'll have to forgive that. It looks ridiculous on my screen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joel. To begin, this is an overview of what we'll be covering tonight. We'll start off with some introductions, review some admissions data, and then get into the juicy details of what critical factors make applicants stand out in law school admissions, and then how to apply those lessons to your own applications. So who is Ingenious Prep? We have over 150 former admissions officers from top law schools across the United States. These are people who sat in admissions committees and determined who got into the law schools and who did not. Then we also have a team of 75 plus graduate coaches who work with our students on the details of crafting their applications. We've also grown our network to include top university professors and researchers, as well as business insiders who help mentor the students that we work with and provide them with unique internships and opportunities to expand their experiences and build their profile. We've also created a database where we've analyzed law school admissions, but looking beyond LSAT scores and GPA. So we've looked at the application process holistically and analyzed personal statements, activities lists, in all parts of law school applications. So all of this, our counseling team, our network, and our data analysis has led to some really wonderful results, with our students being admitted to all of the top law schools in the US, including Harvard, Stanford, Northwestern, Berkeley, and many, many others. On this screen, you can see a list of some of our counselors. The top line are 4 of our former admissions officers. On our team, we have Jean Webb, who read at Yale Law School, and Christina Chong, who read for Harvard Law, as well as NYU Law. On the bottom row, you'll see 4 of our graduate counselors. James Eimers received his JD from Yale, and Melissa Friedman from Harvard. So our team looks just like this and is representative of law schools from across the country. So I just want to stress that this is our team of former admissions officers and graduate coaches. They work exclusively for Ingenious Prep, and together they have over 500 years of admissions experience and have read over 500 1,000 applications. So they have a lot of experience and are excited to help more students get into law school.
Okay.
Do you want to take it from here?
Yeah. So let's dive right in. So we'll start with admissions data and how applications are processed. So a recent report from the LSAC, Law School Admissions Council, shows that as of mid-January, the number of law school applications submitted in the most recent cycle was nearly 11% higher than the prior cycle. So just so everybody kind of understands the overarching trends of law school admissions. So you sort of had like a really big boom in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And then after the financial crisis in 2008, the first thing to go was like the investment banks and different firms. The sort of second wave of serious problems and bankruptcies were in law. So right around the time of like 2011 through 2015-ish, there was a pretty steep decline in the number of applicants to law school, in part because legal jobs were in shorter supply. They were still in fairly decent supply for people from the top schools. And now what we're seeing is sort of a resurgence of popularity in law schools. And what that means for all of you is that unlike the prior decade in which every year we were seeing decreased competitiveness, now we're once again seeing an increase of competitiveness for these jobs, or for these spots at law school. So we'll do a couple of true falses. I'd like it if people could comment in the little comment section, just so I know that you're listening. We can go to the next slide. So true or false? Schools have an algorithm to determine who is accepted or who is rejected. By which I mean they're sort of plugging in GPA, LSAT score, and sort of based on that and a couple of other variables are basically just dropping yeses or nos. Okay, so lots of falses in the comments. Very, very good. It is false. So schools typically use, we can go to the next slide. Schools typically use what's known as the holistic review process, pretty much the same as for college. Somebody said to a degree, though, right? So there's some truth to that. It's not necessarily an algorithm. There are some law schools at which essentially the dean or the director of admissions will pull from the pile of applications people who sort of reach an insanely high threshold for grades and test scores. There's a lot of different reasons for that, but it means that those individual applications don't necessarily go through the regular process. So Yale is one of those schools historically that has done that, or at least they did while Asha was there. So she would basically pull applicants who had crazy high GPAs and test scores from the pile. They wouldn't necessarily be submitted to professors, but they would be automatically admitted. That's a tiny, tiny fraction of the overall population of law students. So for the most part, essentially you're being reviewed holistically the same way that you would for college. The difference is that in college, the GPA and SAT scores or ACT scores, might be 40% of the overall equation, maybe 50% at certain schools. And in law school, it's a bit more like 60 to 70%, depending on the school. But same basic concepts apply. Next slide. How applications are actually processed. So everybody more or less in this group is sort of planning on succeeding in the admissions process. One of the things that I find kind of interesting is that very rarely do I meet students who actually know how applications are processed in the admissions office. So this is sort of how that works. And for those of you who were quite well informed of the college admissions process, you'll find that this is quite similar. I actually find that law school admissions is the most similar to college admissions of the graduate programs, with the slight difference being that the numerical variables, GPA test scores, are slightly more heavily weighted in law school than it is otherwise. So you submit your application. Those applications vary in length, but let's assume that there's somewhere between 10 and 15 pages, depending on your letters of recommendation. So these are added to a massive digital pile that might be, in some cases, like tens of thousands of applications long. As with most admissions offices, most of them will read every application. So from an admissions officer's perspective, this is an incredibly painful experience, right? You might read 1,000 applications a cycle, or if you're, potentially even worse, if you're a professor that is asked to read applications as well, you might have hundreds to get through, and that can be extremely arduous. In fact, several of my friends who are currently adjunct faculty at Yale They have to do that every year, and they really can't stand it. And I'll explain why that's relevant in a minute. So these applications are separated sometimes by region, sometimes by other categories, because they do want sort of geographic diversity among other forms of diversity. And then the individual admissions officers who are assigned to the file read them. They select a handful that they believe merit acceptance. And then in some cases, again, it's not like a professional admissions faculty. Instead, you have professors who are involved in the process. The only difference in terms of how you think about the process is that not unexpectedly, those schools tend to have a more heavy preference for academic work versus kind of practical application work. So we'll talk about that a bit more later. Then the dean of admissions reviews all the top applications and shapes the incoming class. Some schools have like a point system where they're ranking students out of a 1 to 4 scale or 1 to 5 scale. They all do that a little bit differently. Fundamentally, the most important thing to know about this process is that the people reading the applications have a very painful job. Particularly difficult in terms of the amount of drudgery they need to get through. And another way of saying that is if your application looks the same as everyone else's, unless you are one of those like tiny handful of students every year, that 0.1% who has just insane numbers across the board, you're not getting in if you don't stand out. So much like the admissions process for college, standing out and/or we use diversity as a sort of catch-all for the different ways that some students stand out is really the name of the game. Okay, next slide. How about this? True or false? Most law school candidates apply directly from college for law school. Strong showing for false. We got one true. Okay, that's nice. I like that we have one person, although you didn't seem super enthused about your answer. So I'll assume that you don't apologize. It's fine. It's good to at least the way I can feel like at least we're providing some value here. So the answer is false. Most applicants have 1 to 2 years work experience for going to law school. When I was at YLS, the median age, YLS is probably the oldest in terms of the average class age, but the median age was like 27 or 28. So there were a number of people in my class who were well into their mid-30s, several in their early 40s. So the part of the reason that that's the case is that law schools in particular are concerned with issues of like intellectual and emotional maturity, in part because they're so used to people going to law school just because it's like the next step and they don't really know what else to do. So the idea that somebody has actually taken some time and figured it out, they assume is like a better bet long-term than somebody who's right out of college. So yes, taking time off actually does improve your chances of getting into any number of law schools. Doesn't have to be forever. And you can certainly apply right out of law school and take gap years, but it's worth noting that sometimes taking time after college can be quite useful. Okay, next slide. So, true or false? Law school applicants are expected to have deep knowledge of the law before they are admitted. Okay, strong falses. That is indeed false. How about this? True or false? Law schools have a preference for majors that are related to the law, or at least plausibly related. All right, very good. So they don't want, or necessarily, you don't need, and they are not necessarily looking for people who have experience with the law at all. So when I was applying, I had no knowledge whatsoever beyond like a few classes that were at best arguably related to the law. They also don't necessarily care about what you major in. So Gisela mentioned the data that we sort of gathered. So a couple of years back, we basically did this massive survey of students at Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, and a couple of other law schools. And basically what we were trying to figure out, among other things, were like, what are the variables that drive admissions decisions most frequently? We looked at majors, and one of the things that we found that the most successful majors in terms of the percentage of applicants who are accepted that majored in that discipline, that field, was actually music and the performing arts. Now, part of the reason is that there was such a low population that like just one person or two people getting in made a huge difference. But the other part is that more than anything, they want diversity. And it doesn't so much matter what you've done or what you're interested in, so long as you can credibly or plausibly relate that interest or that experience to the law, right? So I'm interested in education and I'm interested in going to law school to do education policy. Or I'm interested in music and I'm interested in going to law school so that I can represent musical talent as an agent, right? These are all fine. What you don't need is anything specifically law related, and that includes summers. You don't need to go intern at a huge law firm where everybody knows you'll just be filing papers. That's not necessary or helpful. Okay, next slide. So the takeaway from this section, and it's a bit of a belabored point, but if you don't make an impression on the admissions officer assigned to your file, he or she will not advocate for you, and as a result, you won't be admitted. Right. So simply put, like in the admissions process, unless you're one of those people who's basically a slam dunk applicant as a result of scores, and again, that population of students is exceptionally small. Like the population of students who are at the very top of their class in college and have, you know, an LSAT score in like the 0.1 percentile, or sorry, the 99.9 percentile, incredibly small. So let's talk about how you actually stand out. Generally speaking, we have. Oh, sorry. The chat on the side just all of a sudden updated. So we can go to the next slide. So generally speaking, you can divide the process of standing out into 4 categories. So the first one is what we call threshold grades and scores. And what we mean by that is most of these institutions are looking for students who are at or above a certain level. We call that level the threshold. And beyond the threshold, getting increasingly higher scores or grades does not make a huge difference. Now, who study economics, this is also known as a point of diminishing marginal returns, right? So increasing your GPA, increasing your LSAT score beyond a certain point doesn't make a huge difference. And generally speaking, that point is somewhere at or above the median grades or test scores of admitted students. There's a couple of reasons why this is the case. One of them is both GPA and LSAT scores have some bearing or some predictive value in terms of how well you do in your first year of law school. The LSAT in particular is one of the only standardized tests that has any true use, as it was intended to predict your performance in 1L. And it actually does that fairly well. Not perfectly, but better certainly than the SAT measures anything. So the second reason that this is true is that law schools are ranked by U.S. News and World Report, as I'm sure you all know. They care about their ranking, whether or not they say they do. And the variables that U.S. News and World Report are using to determine ranking, among them are the average test scores and grades of admitted students. And so if they admit a bunch of students with lower than average test scores and grades, this has the potential of theoretically lowering their rank over time. So admitting one student has absolutely no impact, but if they did it a ton, it would have more and more impact. So it's part of the reason that there's kind of a maintenance of the median in terms of these grades and test scores. And so if you're below that, you need to really justify your spot, and it becomes even more important. So the other 3 are leadership and diversity, direction and fit, and then a consistent theme or application persona. And we'll go through each of these individually in turn. So scores are a threshold matter. They are read as part of your application. They are not necessarily determining factors. Another way of saying this is that they are neither necessary nor sufficient. Obviously, if you have no grades and no test scores, that becomes quite a problem. But I've seen people get into Yale Law with LSAT scores in the 150s. And I've seen people get rejected from Harvard with LSAT scores, well over 175. So they are very important, but they are a threshold matter, meaning it's more about, being in a certain range than every point higher being, successively better than the point below. There are always exceptions. Most of the time what they're using test scores and grades for is a proxy for whether or not the student can survive in 1L year, and will they be able to succeed in the classrooms. So we can move to the next slide. So some of you, I don't know how many of you troll toplawschools.com. That was sort of the big website in my day. I'm sure it's still up and running. It's where really random people pretend to have gotten into really good law schools to piss you off. That's toplawschools.com. That was my favorite, is people would be like, I just got in, I had a 155 or whatever like that. And then you'd look, you'd be like, oh, that's ridiculous. How could this happen? One of the many joys of being an anxious law school applicant. So most of the stuff on toplawschools.com is not useful. Just so everybody knows, there's like more incorrect information than correct information. I found it amusing to look at, but generally speaking, if you take it too seriously, it will lead you in the wrong way. One thing that I did learn from it, and that everybody should know, is the concept of a splitter. So a splitter, which as far as I know is a term that was created on toplawschools.com, is for somebody with a high LSAT and a low GPA, or a high GPA and a low LSAT. So I believe, just anecdotally, that schools have a slight preference for splitters that have a lower GPA and a higher LSAT. I can't prove that. But I've seen a lot more students with like low 3 GPAs and very high LSATs get into like Harvard and Columbia and NYU. I've seen almost no students do that with high GPAs and really low LSATs. I think it's possibly because most schools assume that the LSAT is more predictive of success than GPAs, and some of the studies on that kind of corroborate that fact. So if you have a low GPA, your goal here is to become a splitter with an LSAT performance above the target school's 75th percentile. Another way of saying this is, if you have a low GPA, then the threshold test scores that you need go up, right? So either both of them are sort of at median, or if one is below median, the other one goes up. Also, your sort of extracurriculars and the things that you do outside of class are becoming increasingly important. If you are a splitter, so for example, the co-founder of this company who went to Harvard Law School, he was a splitter, right? So he had a very high GPA, I think something like 3.9, and his LSAT score, he took it 3 or 4 times and could never get over, I think, a 166 or 167, which is by no means a bad score. I mean, I think as far as I know, it's like 95th or 96th percentile, might even be higher. But ended up at Harvard Law. In large part because he had a very interesting application. So he had like started a bunch of fast food restaurants with his family, and was really interested in kind of corporate law generally. So that's why he got in. There was no other reason. Like I'm sure his letters of recommendation were fine, not perfect. But ultimately, having a great application is exceptionally important if you are not one of those people with both extremely high test scores and extremely high grades. So there's a new trend that law schools have been employing to get more applicants, because as I said, until relatively recently, there was declining applications. Part of that is that the LSAT is a terrifying test. It's basically 4 hours, and in those 4 hours, your performance is as important as the collective 4 years of hard work in college. On top of that, it is not a knowledge-based test, so you can't really memorize your way out of it. It is a skills-based test. The other part that I found quite terrifying about it is that the LSAT is such a good proxy for IQ that it is accepted by high IQ societies in lieu of an IQ test. The reason that I find that so scary is because IQ tests are notoriously difficult to study for. So there's sort of this general belief that if you score at a certain level in your diagnostic, you can only increase by so much. That's not true. It's just really, really hard to move up your score by more than 10, 15 points, and not very many people do it. So partly that is why people have been a little bit deterred from going to law school, doing the LSAT. So the law school started adding the GRE and GMAT. I think this is fine. We can go to the next slide. So you can certainly do the GRE and GMAT. The only limitation on it is if if any of your target schools don't accept it, that becomes a big problem. So before you invest in taking the GRE, look at this list or Google which law schools accept the GRE. Make sure that that there aren't any schools that you intend to apply to that aren't on it. So a lot of really good schools are here. There are also a lot of really good schools that aren't. And so you should be a little bit wary of that. So this is a quote from Jean Webb. Jean Webb was the director of admissions at Yale Law School for 18 years. So she is sort of the founder of the modern day law school admissions process. Like any big book on law school admissions, you'll find quotes from her kind of scattered throughout. Jean currently works with us. She's based in New Haven, lovely person. So this is a quote from her. Students and parents often ask me whether grades and test scores are all that matter and whether a student is accepted. My answer is absolutely not. When we evaluate a student, we evaluate their entire application, personal statement, resume, recommendations in particular. perfect test scores and grades are not enough. The student's application itself needs to be spectacular. So again, reinforcing the idea that scores and grades is sort of threshold matters and not as sort of a sufficient conditions in and of themselves. All right, takeaway, very straightforward. We've beaten this horse, I think, quite enough. Let's move right along. Diversity and leadership. So I think that when people hear diversity, their immediate assumption is that diversity is essentially racial, ethnic, religious, nationality. Those are all forms of diversity, and certainly very important ones. But in the context of admissions, diversity is a much broader concept. I mean, it's essentially anything that differentiates you from other applicants. So on like matriculation week or like orientation week, we got this speech by then Dean Robert Post. He's, I think, since stepped down and is now just a professor. But so we started the speech with, "This is the most diverse class in Yale Law School's history. One of us is a certified personal trainer. One of us is an amateur boxer. One of us is a former police officer." It started kind of going on off that tangent. You'll notice that none of those things are race, ethnicity, or religion. And in their mind, the concept of diversity is everything from your kind of personal life experiences and background to like interesting academic interests and extracurricular activities. So fundamentally, diversity is what makes you stand out. It is also what differentiates you from other similarly situated applicants. If you're sort of thinking, well, I'm not an underrepresented minority, so therefore I'm not diverse, you're just simply wrong. There's a lot of other things that can be done. So let's move to the next slide. So here's a few examples. Next slide. Oh, no, sorry, back. It was just delayed. Here's a few examples of diversity. So yeah, race, ethnicity, religion, absolutely. These are things you cannot control, or at least you certainly shouldn't like convert your religion for the purposes of law school admissions. These are certainly forms of diversity. The other things are things like unique work experiences, like for example, being a volunteer sheriff's deputy. Unusual or uncommon extracurricular activities, for example, starting a company, starting a nonprofit, very interesting. Having a diverse background, being trilingual, growing up in a variety of different countries. And uncommon achievements, things like being a published author, published poet, things of that nature tend to be very valuable in helping you stand out and making you more diverse. So leadership is also extremely important. Just so everybody's clear, joining a bunch of organizations and then saying like, okay, I'm going to be the president now, which is like really easy. Like when I was at Dartmouth, I was like the president of like 4 or 5 different organizations that like barely, if ever, met. And everybody knows that that's possible. And everybody knows that students who are really like go-getters do that. It is not useful for admissions. So that was a pretty big waste of my time. I think that, when schools are thinking about the value of leadership, what they're looking for is sustained involvement. So you've done it for a while, not just at like the very end, not just your junior year. They're looking for tangible achievements, like actually impacting somebody. So I believe in the next slide we have a picture of a resume. I could be mistaken. No, we don't. It's somewhere else in the presentation. But actually having legitimate impact. So, for example, if you say I started a nonprofit, great. What did it do? And you need to follow that up with things like and raised this much money, got this many volunteers, accomplished X, Y, and Z. Like those tangible achievements are extremely important. Title is not irrelevant. Generally speaking, the kind of hierarchy is like founder, president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, whatever else the marketing director, member, non-member. But if you have the title and don't have the tangible achievements or don't have sustained involvement over a period of time, it's diminished, if not irrelevant. So direction and fit. Direction is essentially, why law school, right? Why law? Most people want to go to law school or want to go into law because it's a stable job that makes good money. That's just the truth. Not everybody, but certainly a not insignificant percentage of people. That they will not accept, right? So you actually need to have a good reason why the law. Also, by the way, if what you really want to do is go make money, law is probably not the career path for you. Right? There's other ways of making money if that's all you care about. Law is really like, it should be more of a, let's call it a calling. I'm going to law school because I don't know what else to do, and this seems like the logical next step. Not acceptable. Automatically rejected. I want to make more money. Automatically rejected. I'm unhappy in my current career. Not a great answer unless you have a very good reason to believe that law will be better. I'm currently unemployed. Obviously not a great answer. And I want another degree. Like there's a lot of people that I met who I think were doing this. They might have not said it on their application, but I think basically they're like, I got a PhD, so why not just go swoop in and grab a JD while I'm at it? There were like at least 5 of them in my graduating class at Yale. That is not generally accepted or particularly desirable from an admissions office's perspective. So the best reasons are just, I have a particular interest in X, and I want to combine that interest in X with law to accomplish Y. And that can be anything: environmental law, international law, transactional or corporate law, litigation. It can be nonprofit work. It can be policy work, politics. All of these things are totally viable options. But you basically, the best answers are, this is what a law degree enables me to do in the future. And that this can't be like stable career of money. It has to be something like, I actually want to make the world a better place. This is how. So like on my application, I had all these classes that I'd taken that were, about international relations, and I was really interested in international politics. And so my application was fundamentally about how I was going to apply my interest in international politics with the law and get involved in international law. That's the best way of answering them. They need to be concrete. It can't be like pie in the sky, I'm going to save the world and help the innocent. It needs to be as specific as possible. So like, ideally, I want to work at this organization targeting this region of the world, that kind of level of specificity. Here's a list of questions that I'm not going to read out about why do you want to go to law school, to help sort of, brainstorm. Anybody can email Gisela if they want the list. We don't need to read through them right now. So then there's fit, which is, why do you want to go to this law school? I think that people usually only address a single direction of fit, which is, how does this law school help me? So they write a whole application of, how does this law school help me? And that's fine. That's the most important part of fit. What they usually forget is, law schools also want to know what you're bringing to the table, right? Fundamentally, you are an investment, right? So like a lot of top law schools will invest 3 or 4 times as much money per student in their education as you pay in tuition, which is crazy because tuition is outlandishly high. But so like at Yale, for example, they will invest an average of $250,000 per year per student compared to tuition of, I think it was like 50 or 60,000, right? Super high. And so they see you in a lot of ways as an investment, right? Like they want to train people who will go on and do amazing things, bring a lot of great, basically PR for the school, be really well connected in the future, possibly donate. Like, you are an investment. So you also need to say, like, this is what I bring to the table. Like, this is the interesting perspective that I can bring to bear in classroom discussions and on campus. There are a couple of law schools that say, we don't care if you tell us, like, why Harvard, why Yale. Those are really the schools that say that. Like, we don't care why you tell us why Harvard, why Yale. Like, I've genuinely never believed that. And I have very good evidence to suggest that's not true. It's always good to have an argument for why that particular law school is good for you, right? So if you say, I really want to do international law, the first question that they're going to ask is, okay, why this school and not NYU or Columbia? Or how about environmental law? Why not Vermont Law School? Why are you coming here and not there? Which, Vermont Law School historically is one of the best environmental law programs, if not the best. So you have to have credible answers to these questions in your application. That's very important. How to demonstrate fit. I think a lot of these are fairly obvious. The only one that I think bears repeating is, you actually have to do your work on reading their website, understanding the language that they use to differentiate their school from others, researching professors, classes, clinics. Those are very important. Like, you should have, for every school you're applying to, this is at least one class I want to take, one professor I want to do work with, one clinic I want to participate in. Legal clinics are very important. They're sort of like practical application of what you've learned in law. So I did like landlord tenant clinic and defended tenants against being evicted by landlords. So that's like, you want to have a good argument for why like the clinics are valuable to you too. But so you should create a spreadsheet for that. It's quite useful. You can go to the next slide. So we are going to play a game of Harvard Law School admissions. So here's two candidates. This is their actual information. What we want to figure out is, after reading their profile, which one gets into Harvard Law School and why. The school that's arguably the best for environmental policy or environmental law is Vermont Law School. It fluctuates, but historically it has been one or one of the best programs for environmental law. So this is a very smart audience that has not gotten anything wrong. Let's see if we can start now. I'm sure you won't. Can you guys just type out who you think gets into Harvard Law School in the comments there? We got one Cindy, strong Janes, several Cindys. Okay, it's actually kind of split. By the way, first rule of like test taking is like never choose the obvious answer. It's almost certainly bound to be wrong. We were trying to find, like, we had to use actual two people and their actual information. So I don't think we were able to find people who were quite close enough. But so the answer is Jane. And Jane was actually a student of ours, either this last cycle or the prior cycle. So let's look at sort of why Jane gets in. So GPA and test scores. I think it's actually kind of stretched at Jane. She was actually below the threshold, at least for her LSAT scores. Certainly, the other student was way above, like clearly above the threshold for both. Diversity and leadership. So Jane had a very specific and unique passion in environmental law that helped her stand out. She also had a clear impact on her community. The Cindy really didn't. I think that she's sort of the generic student who's like a little bit of the jack of all trades, master of none. So well-rounded, but otherwise unimpressive. And so while those people tend to be, it's funny, I think that when you're at college, those students like Cindy tend to be the most impressive because they're like pretty good at everything. But from an admissions perspective, they're totally non-unique. They're completely common because all those students end up applying to these schools. So they're looking for students who are kind of pointy, meaning that they're like, they're focused in one area and if they've really gone farther in that area. So that's the kind of biggest one. Direction and fit. Jane had concrete details to support her unique career goals. Cindy had typical pre-law experiences that failed to show her specific goals. Cindy was not a student of ours. I don't think we have her application. So we're just sort of, we're assuming that was at least in part the case. And then also the consistent theme. So we'll talk about that next, but we call this an application persona, which is basically sort of like if you were to summarize in a very short sentence the theme of a student, like the environmental law kid. That is very important to make you memorable to admissions officers. It's also very important to help you stand out. So we can move on from that. So application persona. So this is Nike's application persona, right? Just do it. Sort of like a seize the day, carpe diem thing. So you can kind of think of your application persona as your just do it. You can go to the next slide. So the application persona, among other things, number one, it is not it's not an accident. It's not something you stumble into. It is something that you consciously create over time. There's also not a box on the application that's like, what is your persona? But you have to ask yourself sort of what is the unifying theme or passion around which my activities and experiences are organized. That's your persona, right? So for somebody who's just about to apply, you have to basically sit down with your resume and say, okay, what's the unifying principle here among my most important activities? What has animated me to do these things? For somebody who's younger, freshman, sophomore, even a beginning junior year, it's something that you're sort of reflecting on and then sculpting your activities around. So fundamentally, the application persona serves kind of like having a thesis in a paper, very much so. Yes. I think that if you construe the application as being an argument, right, it is an argument for why you should be admitted. The application persona is your primary argument. And you can kind of think about an application that is without an application persona as being, somewhere between 5 to 10 very weak arguments, right? So it's like application persona, one very strong argument. This is why I should be admitted. No application persona, 5 to 10 very weak arguments, right? So obviously it's better to have one very strong than 5 to 10 very weak. So that's the kind of persuasiveness element to it. There's also memorability, right? If an admissions officer has to read 1,000 applications, they are not going to remember the Cindy applicant, right? They're not going to remember the person who's like pretty good at a lot of different things, but is otherwise completely impossible to summarize. They'll remember the student who has a very clear, let's say thesis in their application, a kind of central animating force. And that will make it a lot easier for them to go back to that application and then advocate for that application. So it's very important. So applying these lessons to your application. Let's start with the personal statement. So some of these things are super generic, I understand, but the number of students who still don't get these is kind of astounding. So I'll try to move through them quickly, but they are really important. So firstly, show who you are. The personal statement is personal. It is not about other people. Don't write about your parents or your grandparents or somebody you really admire. Even worse, don't write about any historical figure unless you knew them personally and the bulk of the essay is actually about you. The way too many applications are about family members, and particularly family members who have suffered, and how that has prompted somebody to get up and want to be a lawyer to defend the weak and the helpless. But the problem is that part only comes at the end. The rest of the application is about their parents or their grandparents. And it's like most admissions officers will say something like, I really wish I could admit your grandfather, but I'm not admitting you. So it is a selfish essay. It is about you. Show what makes you unique. This is essentially just the application persona, as is the show how the pieces of your application fit together, right? The essay should reinforce the persona, right? So if you are environmental law kid, that essay better be about environmental law, right? Not this is what I think we should do with environmental law. That's a bit presumptuous, but this is ultimately how I would like to be involved over time, and what I see my role in the kind of in the future being. Show your personality. Nobody wants to be sitting in class next to a robot. Like there were a number of those in law school, and they were extremely uncomfortable to spend time with. Admissions officers don't want those kids. Like they want people who have enough personality to eventually lead other people. So show your personality. Don't be afraid to be funny. Don't be afraid to be sarcastic. So does not everything needs to be super sad and depressing in a personal statement. That's what most people think. It's honestly more effective to be funny, because they get so few funny applications, and after the 100th essay about something brutal and sad and depressing, they're excited to get like something interesting, something funny, something that makes them smile or laugh. Lastly, show, don't tell. This is the difference between saying I'm the smartest person in the world and saying I proved the following 3 to 5 theorems and as a result can conclusively state I'm the smartest person in the world. If you have to state something outright, you're not doing a good enough job convincing somebody, right? So lead with evidence, don't lead with statements. I'm interested in international law, not good. Here's the things that I have done, and ultimately that leads me to want a career in environmental law, much better. But it should be sort of easy to deduce what you're saying from the evidence and the anecdotes. You shouldn't need to state things outright. Next slide. So common mistakes in the personal statement, writing your resume twice. I have seen students literally sit next to their resume and write their personal statement and literally duplicate some of the verbiage from the resume. It's a total waste of space. Nobody wants to read that, least of all the admissions officers. If there shouldn't be duplicate information, right? The personal statement should effectively be an opportunity to go deeper on a very select item or select moment related to those items, right? Not to be a grand, like each paragraph is a slightly enhanced version of your resume. Don't do that. Trying to accomplish too much, very similar, right? Don't talk about like 5 activities. I think that the best personal statements I have ever read, so the best personal statement I ever read of the years running this company and of the God knows how many that I've read for different types of schools was actually a medical school essay that started with nobody cares when you die in Cape Town. And it was like a really kind of attention grabbing, first sentence. And it was about this like singular moment where this guy was watching somebody die on the side of the road in Cape Town, and how that affected his thoughts about healthcare in developing countries, and kind of ultimately his life goals with respect to being a doctor. The entire thing centered around maybe 15 seconds of his life. Really, really fantastic. The worst ones I've seen are like they span years, different activities, different interests. They're all over the place. I had read a personal statement for law school at one point that was about like wakeboarding. Like nobody cares to read that. Okay. Anyway, exaggerating adversity. Adversity is for the purpose of admissions means every single person anywhere reading it agrees that it is adversity. There are like everybody has something tough in their background or in their life. Admissions officers are not interested in empathizing more than immediately comes to them, meaning that unless the answer to the question, would every single person agree that this is true adversity, you should not try to write an essay about how difficult your life has been, because it doesn't play well when there are other people applying who are like we had kids in my class at Yale who had grown up dirt poor in third world countries, and had worked like relentlessly and endured such horrible suffering that the idea that any of us would say, oh, like our lives were tough in comparison was very different. So be very careful about the adversity. High school achievements obviously should not be included. Writing about others, we've already talked about that. Discussing academic inconsistencies or other issues. Like I did badly on this French class. That's an addendum that is not for the personal statement. So all that stuff can be pushed off to the addendums. So here's a student from last admission cycle. So I guess we've anonymized this, MW. So they went to a top school. I think based on the way that this is written, that the student was probably at like a UChicago type of school. So very, very good, top school. GPA 3.7, LSAT score 170, worked as a paralegal after graduation. Before we started working with, I'm just going to call this person M. Before we started working with M, the personal statement wasn't personal enough. It talked a lot about his parents. Again, it does not matter really what has happened. If you're talking about other people, it's just not going to kind of go well in the admissions office. They just don't know you well enough. So the first draft also was pretty bad on the sort of his goals for law school. So like he talked a bit about my goals in law, but ultimately was highly unspecific. And again, what you need is for these things to be highly, highly concrete and specific. If they are general, the assumption is that you're just one of those students who's going to law school because it's like the next thing to do. After rounds of edits and feedback, his personal statement was much more focused on him. So this is an excerpt from it. My mother and father, born in post-Soviet rural Finland and St. Lucia, respectively, were products of poor families, each seeking a better life in the United States. I was primarily raised in the charmed suburbia of Connecticut, and through my time in each of my parents' home countries, became distinctly aware of how lucky I was to have the opportunities afforded to me. That awareness drove me, pushing me to never squander the prospects with which my family had furnished me. Right, so there is a mention of the parents. It is very brief. That's the whole mention of the parents. The rest of it is about this person, right? Much, much better. We don't want the inverse proportions. The final draft also captured why he wanted to go to law school, basically talking about a career in international law and specifically how that relates to his interests and how he would apply that skill set. We don't need to read the whole thing, I don't think. So in the end, gets into Stanford. I think that the students that you most often hear about getting into these schools are students who are like a 3.9 and a 175. And those students definitely do get in, but those are also the least common applicants. More students who are getting in look like this, right? So they have a very good GPA, but not the best. They have good LSAT scores, but not the best. But their personal statement and their experiences are extremely compelling. That's really the most important part. The resume. The resume should highlight the elements of leadership that I mentioned before. So here, leadership, I'm basically talking about titular leadership. So your title. That is one factor. It's not really the only factor. It's probably, at least in my opinion, it's the least important of the three. Sustained involvement, doing things over a longer period of time, not just doing things starting your junior or senior year. Tangible achievements. If you can't answer the question, so what did you do, then it might as well not be in your resume. You have to be able to answer the so what question. That's very important. Just as a note, there's a distinct legal style resume that you can Google very easily. I strongly recommend that you use it. You don't want to be the one person who has like the color coded, with like the picture of you in the top left corner, and it's like, the marketing resume is what I think about it as being. That will not play well. So here's some excerpts from a resume. The thing that I think is most interesting here is just the very concrete achievement. So hired and managed socially and racially diverse 80 plus person staff, right? That is a humongous group of people that this person hired. Raised over $1 million and managed $500,000 in annual budget. Right? Those things are extremely concrete. That's what we mean by tangible achievements. Now, granted, this is a particularly remarkable resume line item. It doesn't have to be this grand. But it does need to be that specific and that kind of quantifiable. You can see the difference between that and saying, I was president of the school newspaper, and as the president of the school newspaper, I helped conceive of several ideas that were important for the creative direction of the newspaper, and wrote articles on the occasion. Like, it's just too non-specific, as opposed to I was the president of the newspaper, like redesigned the outlay, recruited an additional, doubled the staff. Increased production from once every 3 months to once a month, right? Very tangible. We can go to the next slide. Quantitative achievements better. I think that it's just that quantitative achievements tend to be more easily reported. It's not necessarily that they're better. I think that it being tangible is really the most relevant question. So I'm sure that there are qualitative achievements that are more or less tangible, but if your qualitative achievement is I made this person feel much better, like that can't be proven, right? It's kind of a matter of its evidentiary value, right? Can it be proven? Can it be demonstrated to be real? If it is non-falsifiable, that's not as good. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but it's unfortunately the best I can do. Most achievements can be quantified somehow. There aren't that many that are completely unquantified. Well, thank you. All right, letters of recommendation. So letters of recommendation, I think, are probably, outside of the personal essay and possibly including the personal essay, the most important part of the application. You can go to the next slide. The reason that they're so important is because they fill in a really important knowledge gap. They're the only third-party objective source of information to the admissions office. They're taken extremely seriously by the admissions office. Like, for example, one of the things that we found in our kind of statistical analysis was that students who had letters of recommendation from law school professors were substantially more likely to be admitted to certain law schools, and in part that's because their testimony, let's call it, is taken very, very seriously. It's given a lot of weight. You can go to the next slide. So most people, when they're asked for letters of recommendation, they do what is like essentially a cardinal sin in admissions, which is like you basically just like give the slip to the professor or ask the professor and then, send them the email and that's it. Really, really bad idea. Like, you need to exercise as much control as possible in this process. So firstly, asking the right people early. Academic references are very important. You want to be asking professors. If you've been a varsity athlete for 3 or 4 years, you should probably ask your coach. If you have like a law school professor that can write for you, great. It is not okay to just say, will you write a recommendation? You need to come with your resume. You need to come with your personal statement, or at least a draft of it. You need to come with an outline of topics you'd like them to discuss. So this is the most uncomfortable part of the entire admissions process. Like, you actually need to sit there with these people and say, here's a list of items I would really like it if you could address. Do you feel comfortable writing these? And then going through them. Now, it shouldn't be ludicrous, right? It can't be like 2 pages of requests. That's a bit excessive. But you definitely need to have like some idea of like, for example, asking a professor, like, I know that you've written for other students who went to really good law schools. Do you feel comfortable comparing me positively to those students, even if anonymously? That's very important, right? Those kinds of comparative statements are very important. So you have to go in, have to take control of the process. So finally, helping them understand what makes a good letter of recommendation, which we'll talk about in a moment, what makes a good letter of recommendation. Academic references are, I would probably, if you've been in work for several years, I mean, depends on what you mean by several, like, but if you've been out of school for like 2 or 3 years, I'd still probably get an academic reference, just one. But if you're talking about like 5 to 10 years, that's just too far away. So I'd probably go with, with like employers, et cetera. So what great letters of recommendation look like? First, intimacy. The longer and the more kind of deeply they know you, the better. Obviously, people get letters of recommendation from like senators, governors, presidents. Unless they know you personally, it is of no use. I strongly discourage you from trying that unless you really know this person really knows you, and not in just a personal context. It knows you professionally or academically. Academic, personal, and professional assessments. Will the candidate excel in law school or as a lawyer? What is the credibility that this person has to say that? Right? Why are they a credible witness that you will be a good law student? Right? What they need to kind of back that up. Superlative praise is kind of an obvious statement. You need superlative praise. This person is the best, right? Not this person is good. There's a saying that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which is called damning by faint praise. That's what happens often in letters of recommendation, is that you get faint praise, and that is damning because all of the other students have superlative praise. Concrete details, just like the letter of recommendation, just like the personal statement. If someone says, this student is just the best, but doesn't provide any actual evidence, it is not useful. You need to have very concrete anecdotes, right? So this is one of the areas where you talk with the professor or the recommender saying, like, here's some concrete anecdotes about things that you might want to mention in the application or in the letter of recommendation. Comparative praise. I actually think this is probably the most effective and underutilized, which is, if you're a professor and you have written letters of recommendation for other successful law school applicants, the best thing that you can do is say, this student is better than any of these other students that I wrote for that went to the following law schools. The reason is that you're kind of anchoring all of your other comments about the student. So comparative praise is very important, and you should ask for it every time from every recommender. Like, super valuable as an evidentiary segment. And then enthusiasm. They should be enthusiastic, obviously. We can go to the next slide. So my segment is done. Thank you all for being a very patient audience, and I'll turn it back over to Gisela.
Thank you, Joel. So this slide just gives you an overview of some of the many, or a sampling really, of the many law schools that our students have been admitted to. So they include law schools such as Harvard, NYU, Stanford, Cornell, University of Virginia. And like I said, this is just a sampling, and there are many others as well. I'm going to briefly talk about our programs. So we have 3 relevant to law school applicants. The first is our candidacy building program. You can start as early as your freshman year of college, and this program is focused on early planning and strategizing for students who want to build their profile over a period of time. So in this program, students would get help with course selection, with guidance on extracurricular activities, and even how to appropriately spend their summers and other breaks so that they're the most competitive that they can be once it is time for them to begin their applications. Our application counseling program focuses on guidance on writing the application from beginning to end. And students here would be working with our former admissions officers and graduate coaches on writing the personal statements, on their legal resumes, activities lists, and every component that goes into the application before they submit it to the law schools. And lastly, we do have an application final review. This program is best for those students who don't feel that they need help with the details of the application, but do want an extra set of eyes from somebody who knows the process. So they would submit it ideally about a month prior to when they want to, or they would submit the application to us about a month prior to when they want to submit it to their law schools, and then have one of our counselors review it and give them feedback. So If you have any other specific questions about your own candidacy building, you can feel free to reach out to me via email at gisela.zambrano@ingeniusprep.com. At this time, we are going to take a few questions. We are running out of time, so we won't be able to get to too many. But I did want to start off with one that I saw come in during the webinar. Joel, if you could speak to how, like, a student who has been out of school for about 2 to 3 years, where their leadership should be focused on. Should it be leadership that they exhibited in undergrad or once they were out of school?
Yeah, so almost certainly not in undergrad, unless there is something that you started in undergrad that you continued thereafter. You probably want to look to leadership in the workplace. So a lot of people that go into law school are coming out of like Teach for America, consulting, and banking. I know that that's sort of an unusual combination of things, but it's a very high proportion of the top law schools that are coming from those different, like specifically TFA, and then like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, et cetera. I think that looking for like what you did in the workplace, what initiatives you took on, and then also like what you did outside of the workplace. Like if you had any kind of, passions or hobbies that were like related to your future interests, that's very important. But I think focusing on college at that stage is sort of a bit like if you're applying right out of college and you're talking about high school achievements, it's just a little too dated.
Excellent. And then also for those applicants watching who are international students, they're wondering how the application differs, if at all, for them.
So, part of the difference is that a lot of international students will do like an LLM program, which is, a 1-year program. It's basically just like the 1L year of law school. Typically, that means that you're kind of getting a law degree in your home country and then getting an LLM in the United States and then going back to practice rather than staying in the US. That's not necessarily the case. The nice thing about the LLM is that you don't have to take the LSAT. Yay. It doesn't quite have the same cachet as getting a JD. Doesn't afford you quite the same amount of career growth over time as a JD does. And it also makes it harder for you to get a job in the US than a JD. The only difference for you guys is that it's a little bit harder to get a job in the US generally just because of visa sponsorship. The jobs are pretty high paid, generally speaking, so that makes it easier to get the visa. But it's still not super simple. As a result, part of the strategy that we see a lot with our international students is that they'll get a JD in the US, and then the goal is to basically work in the international office of a US firm. The reason that is of value is that each of these firms has what is called global pay, means that no matter where you are, you're paid the same. And that is valuable because a lot of the time, the places with basically it means that like based on the cost of living, you're getting paid substantially more than you otherwise would. And you don't have to work in the US, you can work elsewhere. That might have been too much detail, but fundamentally everything else is the same. There isn't much of a difference other than that.
Excellent. And then we'll take one last one. Joel, how much should these students be looking at ranking, especially from News and World Report when choosing law schools?
This is kind of a tough question because I know that like my answer is considered super politically incorrect, but I also think that it is factually correct. So the short answer is that law firms care a tremendous amount about the name brand of the school that you attend. The reason that is the case is that when they're assigning associates to different cases, the clients will look at the background and all they know is to look at the law school. And if they see a bunch of people from law schools that they've not heard of, they'll say like, no, we don't want those associates. We want your associates from these law schools. That's quite common. And so it's not so much that going to those top law schools are the only schools where you can get prepared to do those jobs. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But it is very important for employment. And it depends where you want to get employed. So if your goal is to go to law school and then get a job at like one of the big firms, right, like Latham and Watkins, Wachtell, Skadden, Cravath, like the really high-ranking, high-flying firms, then going to a name brand school, and that usually means like top 14, top 10, is quite important. If your aspirations are elsewhere, like public policy, nonprofit work, teaching or local governance, that becomes less important. I would be careful about going to a quote unranked law school, only because, frankly, a lot of law schools have had financial trouble recently, and the unranked law schools are probably most at risk for going bankrupt, which invalidates the value of your degree. So I would stick with schools that are definitely ranked and definitely have a long legacy. And law schools that are lower ranked will be very aggressive about getting you to come. I have about 1 million emails in my inbox from back in the day from a school called Pacific McGeorge that was like free tuition and we'll pay for you to move. And so like the idea there is you have to be very careful. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. You guys, we are unfortunately out of time. I do see other questions in the chat. So if you could reach out to me via email, I would be happy to set up a time to talk to you guys about your own candidacy building or candidacy. But thank you so much for attending. Joel, thank you so much for sharing all of your insight.
Thanks, guys.
Have a wonderful night.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.